Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here and to visit this site for the first time. And I live 5 minutes from here, so glad I'm here today. So the title has to do with MRI, which is my main topic of interest. I've been an MR researcher for about 15 years. And recently, like many others, I dived into AI and deep learning, and we've had a lot of issues with MRI that we are trying to solve. And today, I'm gonna present to use some of the challenges that that could be solved with AI. But more interestingly, how can MR physics inform and maybe improve some of the deep learning architectures and models. So what stands behind MRI? Magnetic resonance imaging. What is MRI? Let's try to explain how that works in 1 minute. I've been spending years trying to understand how MRI works, so let's try to make a 1 minute thought. So the first aspect with MRI is that it's an imaging technique. It's a non-invasive imaging technique, unlike what we see in this picture. The main idea is that we place a body into a very strong magnet. It could be 3 Tesla, which is usually used in clinics. When we do that, the nuclear spins of the water molecules tend to align with that magnetic field, so in this direction. Another property is that they also rotate with a particular frequency, which is called the Larmor frequency. And the interesting thing is that if we apply a particular some energy with a particular frequency, those spins will tend to get this energy and then to re-emit it. And that's where the MR signal comes from. Now the question is, how do we get an image? This image we get thanks to gradients, because if we apply a magnetic gradient along those 3 directions, X, Y, Z, we can spatially encode the signal based on the frequency of the spins. So what we end up with, the raw MRI signal is basically a K-space, what we call the K-space data, which is a frequency encoded signal. How do we get an image? By applying a Fourier transform. And that's pretty much what we get at the end of the MR image reconstruction pipeline. So that's the traditional MRI. Now we hear a lot about microstructure or in vivo histology with our reality. In very high resolution, we see that there are some neurons, there are some axons that connect the neurons together. And ideally, what we would like to do with MRI is to be able to interrogate, to get some quantitative measures of, for example, axon density or neuron density, because in some disease, we know that they tend to degenerate. And it would be nice if MRI could be sensitive to that. Good news is that MRI is, but it's not very intuitive. Knowing the image resolution of MRI, which is usually 1 millimeter or 2 millimeter, how with 1 millimeter big pixel can we have an information about the number of axons, or how they connect to each other, or how they activate? We get these informations using something called quantitative MRI or multiparametric MRI. And these are advanced techniques, mostly used in research, but some of them are now used in clinics. And there are different categories of quantitative MRI, what we call microstructure MRI. And there are a lot of techniques based on the diffusion of water molecules, based on the energy spectrum of the macromolecules. And through those techniques, we can have some information about, for example, the density of the neurons. Okay, and there are some biophysical models that are behind those techniques. I'm sure you've all heard about functional MRI that enables to measure neuronal activity. About MRI, and ultimately used to better understand the pathophysiology of some disease, and at the end of the day, derive objective biomarkers that would enable us to objectively assess if a particular drug would, demyelinate in case of multiple sclerosis, for example. So that's it about qMRI and the biophysical. But once we gather those data, it's another story, because we need to process those. And it's not easy to process quantitative MRI data because there is a lot of steps included. And, a student could spend 4 years PhD just looking at, how to correct for distortions induced by MRI. As you can see, there is a lot of steps. So often, unfortunately, biased or not properly made, and it's extremely difficult to basically have an entire expertise of how to pre-process the data in order to obtain, at the end of the day, a quantitative marker of MRIs, and led to some raising some skepticisms about some of the papers in neuroimaging. The good news is that we know where the problem lies, and there are tools to address some of the processing problems. And deep learning has been increasingly used for categorizing or segmenting some of the structures. So obvious applications are for segmenting different parts of the central nervous system, for example, the gray matter, the white matter, to create masks that are then used by radiologists to interrogate in the white matter, for example. And just to give you a main conference of MRI, which this year is happening in Montreal, exponential raise of the number of publications of abstract submissions using deep learning, and going to happen for 2019, but it's quite impressive. So I'm going to show you some examples that are ongoing in our lab, and how we link that to deep learning, and what would be the next steps in relation with MRI. One project has to do with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, which is a terrible disease, where the lifespan is only a couple of years. And this is related to a degeneration of motor neurons in the brain and in the spinal cord. There is still no cure, and therefore it's important to diagnose that disease earlier. That would help to categorize patients better and help pharmaceutical companies design drugs for particular phenotypes of the disease. So when we talk about neuron degeneration, we are interested in looking at the gray matter, because the gray matter is where the neuronal cells are. And so we've shown in a study that by looking at the gray matter, which is the little butterfly that you see inside the spinal cord, if we are able to segment this gray matter, then we show that we have a much better predictor of to differentiate ALS patients from normal healthy controls. And this kind of biomarkers, only based on the segmentation, is also helpful to predict what's going to be the outcome of the disease after 1 year. So that's a good application for deep learning. Can we make a robust tool for automatic segmentation of the gray matter? So that's been the project of Christian Perron, who was a master student in my lab. And the context of his studies was that there is a lack of images and also of manual labels. So UNet has been a very popular method for segmentation tasks, but sometimes high-level feature maps, the one at the bottom, are noisy, and most of the information is contained at the low-level layers. So the idea here was to reach higher levels with less convolutions. And he looked into the atrophy-spatial pyramid pooling or dilated convolutions that add holes in the convolution kernels. And it provides a significant parameter reduction with increasing the effective resecting fields by preserving the input resolution throughout the network. So in brief, you can get more details into the paper, but in brief, we trained this architecture with only 40 different images from 4 different sites. And results show very robust, so highly accurate and robust segmentations. We also applied the same architecture to train another model based on ex vivo high resolution scans, where only 10 slices were manually segmented, and then the entire data set of almost 5,000 slices were then segmented automatically. So that was very useful and encouraging. We wanted to go a bit further, and the main context that many researchers in biomedical imaging are thinking is that first of all, it's difficult to get data, but when we get data, when we have access to publicly available data sets, another thing that is missing are labels. Labels could take the form of pixels that are labeled as 1 or 0, depending on if they are present in the structure that we want to segment. Okay. So labels are difficult to generate. It takes time, it takes expertise. Usually we have to ask radiologists to do them, and they don't have time to do that. So labels are a scarce resource in medical imaging. So the idea was to train a model using unlabeled data. So we have access to a lot of data, and we also have access to a portion of labels for some of this data. So the idea is to use a method called the mean teacher method here to benefit from the unlabeled data and improve the performance of the segmentation. So in the mean teacher method, there is a student model and a teacher model. So the student model, which we see here, learns in a traditional way with inputs. The images are input into the student model, as well as the ground truth labeled data. For the teacher model, the teacher receives only the unlabeled data without any label, and the prediction is used along with the segmentation loss, which is the dice, to update the weights of the student model. So for the teacher model, the weights of the model are obtained by averaging the weights of the student model here that were obtained through the previous trainings. So over time, the prediction of the teacher model will tend to be more accurate than the student model. And so the main trick of this paper, which originally was used for categorization task, and in this case was used for segmentation task. The main trick here was to basically make sure that the unlabeled data obtain the same data augmentation transformation as for the teacher and for the student model. So the trick was basically to modify the architecture so that the data augmentation, which could be a rotation or scaling, is applied on the estimated labels in output of the teacher model and as an input of the student model. So we used the traditional unit and the same data set as before, with 40 subjects for training and 40 for testing. And the results overall show better performance of the semi-supervised learning. with an augmentation of dice, accuracy, precision, so most of the metrics. And again, you can see more details on the published paper. So Christian was quite motivated and wanted to further improve and basically generalize those approaches. And the next question that comes is, what happens if there is a new site, a new contrast that comes into play? Would this trained model work as well if data from Australia would come in? The answer is unfortunately no, because the data could be quite different. And that led us investigate the idea of applying the mean teacher model for a domain adaptation task. So the idea here was to combine the mean teacher method that we investigated in the previous paper with an unsupervised domain adaptation that was proposed by French et al. So briefly, the domain that we want to adapt our model to has unlabeled data. So this is so that's the similar mean teacher model, but the only difference is that the unlabeled data are coming from another domain. And it's augmented in a similar way, in parallel to the student model. And the output of the teacher model is used in order to basically update the weights of the student model using an exponential moving average as before. So the results here was based on 4 centers, so the same centers as before. And what we did here was to train the model on the first 2 centers. The evaluation was done on the 3rd center, and the testing was done on a 4th center. So the 4th center didn't see the data used for training. And again, results show fairly good improvement for this domain adaptation approach. In order to make sure that the improvement was not done by the exponential moving average, we also did an ablation study to basically rule out the potential effect of the mean teacher and exponential moving average approach. And you can see more details in this paper, and it's also now accepted in the neuroimaging. So that was an overview of the approaches for segmentation and how to deal with the scarcity of labeled data. I want to move into another application, which is mapping of multiple sclerosis lesions in the central nervous system. So what you can see on the left is a brain scan from a 70 scanner showing clear white matter lesions in an MS patient, and the similar lesions also happen in the spinal cord, but they have been much less described throughout MRI because it's usually difficult to get proper image quality in this part of the central nervous system. So the goal of this study was to do a comprehensive mapping of MS lesions across different centers, different MS centers in the world, who generously shared about 600 patients. And neuroradiologists segmented those lesions. And then the further analysis was done using software developed in our lab, the Spinal Toolbox. And once we got those manual labels, of course, we wanted to train some deep learning tools in order to detect those lesions automatically. So that was the project of Charles Legros, who is a PhD student in my lab. And one of the main challenges of those segmentation tasks is that there is a large class imbalance. Basically, we input data, which are big volumes, 3D volumes with 100,000 of voxels. And MS lesions are represented by only a very, very small fraction of voxels inside these big volumes. Could be 10, 20 voxels. compared to 100,000 voxels. So it makes the deep learning network, it makes it very challenging for the models to learn where to spot those lesions. So in order to address that, we did basically a cascade of convolutional neural networks. And the first convolutional neural networks dealt with finding where the spinal cord center line is. And once we identify where the spinal cord is, we basically extract 3D patches around the region of interest where we know lesions are going to be located. We don't expect lesions to be located in the muscles or in the bones. We do expect lesions in the central nervous systems. And once we extract those patches, then we can train a model that is better balanced and performs better. So that's been implemented in Keras and is available as open source in our package. And briefly, the results is that this approach is robust to image contrast and orientation. There is an overall good sensitivity, but still there is a lot of false positives. So we end up estimating lesions where, in fact, there is no lesion. And those false lesions could be due to image contrast. And that's going to drive another part of the talk, which I'm going to show you shortly. So briefly, what did we do with that? We ended up gathering all those information, all those lesion masks from all those 600 patients, registering them non-linearly into a template that has been obtained in collaboration with the Polytechnique, Aix-Marseille University, and the MNI at McGill. And then all those lesion masks were summed in order to obtain a so-called probability lesion map. And that probability lesion map is the first non-invasive and in vivo mapping of how MS lesions are located in the spinal cord, and that could be useful for looking at where those lesions are in terms of the vertebral levels, and also what are the specific tracts that are affected by those lesions. And again, that could help to better phenotype MS patients and target specific drugs. Another project that is ongoing, where deep learning is going to the rescue for our MR challenge, is for the prognosis of degenerative cervical myelopathy, or DCM. So the context of this pathology is that there is a lot of patients, and often it's non-symptomatic. So many of us in this room are affected by this disc bulging, which in a couple of years might progress into some symptomatic compression, pain, and motor deficits. The goal here is to predict the outcome of these patients in order to decide whether to operate or not. Usually neurosurgeons, which we collaborate with, the team of Michael Fellings in Toronto Western Hospitals, they, on a daily basis, they face the problem of receiving patients and having an MRI like that, and not knowing whether they have to operate the patient or not. Knowing that operating those patients also has a great risk because they are touching a very sensitive area here. So the context of this study was to basically use about 500 patients that are a part of the AO-Spine myelopathy database, which are preoperative and postoperative MRIs. We also have access to the clinical scores before and after the surgery. So the idea was to train neural networks. So we use an inception net with 4 inception modules that basically has the MRIs of the 3 different orientation, as well as the clinical data. And the goal of the output of these neural networks was to predict the clinical score of those patients. Are they progressing or not? That was basically a binary output. So we started with that, and we can already see that there's an improvement of adding the MRI as opposed to only considering the clinical scores. The improvement was extremely small, and we also were facing likely some overfitting. So there's still a lot to do, and we need to be very cautious with these conclusions. The next steps that Lucas Rouillet, who is a student in the lab, is investigating is to use preprocessing tools in order to train network on segmented images. So basically reduce the dimensionality of the input MRI data because there's just too much degree of freedom. And also look at other architectures that would be more robust, and also maybe looking at QMR metrics that might get more information about the state of the central nervous system. So I've shown you a couple of applications, a couple of concrete clinical applications where deep learning is useful, and there's still a lot to explore. But there are also some outstanding issues. In general, when we see published papers, the code is rarely publicly available, and when it is, it's difficult to basically use it out of the box. That's complementary to the fact that there is also a low amount of data available, and especially manual labels. And for obvious reasons, the IRB and privacy reasons limit the hospitals to share those data. On top of that, there is also very image resolution, which is difficult to set a proper batch size, not talking about differences in contrast, MR scanners, and so on. When we want to train with multiple contrasts, sometimes some data sets are missing, contrasts are missing. So there's basically, if we look at all the MR sites in the world, it's difficult to propose one-fit-all solution because there is always some outliers site. And when we look at papers, and our lab is part of it, it's usually models are validated and trained in well-curated single-center data sets. And, when people try to apply those models in other centers, it usually fails. And when we look at it more closely, people are different, but not that much. So that's an example of different T1 weighted MP range MR sequences. So it's the same sequence that has been applied to different subjects, right? So you can see that the shape is different, the brain is a bit different, but the contrasts are pretty much the same. However, if we look at the same subject acquired with different MRI sequences, resolution, techniques, we end up with images that are extremely different from each other, right? So that's where the problem is. How can we solve that? There are some avenues that have been already explored. There is generative adversarial networks, or GANs, where the idea is to treat each clinical center as a domain, and then create a functional map that can basically represent all those centers into a synthetic space. One problem is that image features not only vary between center, but also across a large number of acquisition parameters. So we cannot basically say that Australia will be treated as one domain, because within Australia, they could use a T1 weighted sequence or T2 weighted or T2 star, and all those images would be different. And maybe we could treat each contrast as a domain, but then what do we call a contrast? There's also different features within each contrast. So makes it difficult to apply those approaches, not impossible. Another aspect is that there could be some bias when domains are tagged, and if, let's say, models are trained with patients with big tumors in particular locations of the brain. There could be some spurious estimation of tumors in healthy patients, for example. Another aspect is that we should really consider taking advantage of the multiple MR contrasts that are available. In fact, usually when we put someone in the scanner, we don't take only one image. We take 6, 7 different contrasts. And there are approaches, for example, the HEMIS architecture that has been developed at the Mila, where multiple contrasts are used in order to train models and do a particular task. So these, I think, are very interesting avenues. One avenue that has been less discussed in the literature is to inject priors from the MR physics world. And the idea here is that we know that we type in when we scan someone. We know what would be the, let's say, the TR parameter, the TE parameter. So these are, when we program the MRI to scan someone, we know what are the numbers. So why not trying to input those numbers into the architecture so that the model would learn alongside the images how the contrast would be generated, and ultimately that could improve the performance of those models. How do we do that? So that's an ongoing project that is supported by IVADO and in collaboration with the Mila. One approach that we've started to explore is the film, which basically stands for the visual reasoning with a general conditioning layer. And so the film learns to adaptively influence the output of a neural network by applying an affine transformation to the network's intermediate features based on some inputs. So those inputs could be the MR parameters. So in the original paper, film has been demonstrated for visual and language tasks, but let's see how we can adapt that for an image segmentation task. So let's take an image, an MRI image as an input, a traditional convolutional neural network that would then learn to do a specific task. In that case, it would be to automatically segment the spinal cord, which you see in the middle of the image here. Okay. When we adapt this for the film, this CNN, which could be a unit, some of the output at each layer are modified, and they are basically modified using an affine transformation. And this affine transformation is defined by parameters beta, which is an offset, and gamma, which is a scaling factor. And those beta and gamma are estimated by a film generator, which in our case is a multi-layer perceptron that takes as input the MRI parameters. In that case, the flip angle, the echo time, repetition time, and so on. So our hope here is that the film generator would learn how the image contrast is generated by the various MR acquisition parameters that would help us ultimately to generalize better to unseen contrast, so to contrast that has not been seen during the training procedure. The next question is, that's the theory, that's the implementation. What data set do we use? For that, our lab has initiated a large open access multi-center data. It's called the Spine Generic database. It involves about 35 sites. It's a multi-vendor protocol, so we have access to data from the 3 main vendors. As I said, it's multi-subject, but also multi-contrast. So there is 6 different contrasts, about 6 subjects per site, 15 slices per volume. So it gives about 20K images. And the great news is that it comes with labels. So all those images are open access. You can already download them. And we are currently curating the labels, but they will also be available soon for the community. So that's the data set we've been using. And these are some preliminary results which were based on 5 different contrasts for the training. Okay. And the testing was done on another contrast that has not been seen during the training. Okay, so a new contrast, but also new sites. Results, extremely preliminary, it came out this morning, is that when we compare the traditional unit with the unit modified by, for each layer applying the film modification, we see a slight improvement of the dice. Again, this is extremely preliminary, so we didn't really have time to brainstorm and analyze those results. But it's, we're getting there. The implementation is there. So now we need to sit and discuss what could be the next steps. And there are obvious limitations in this current approach. One of the limitations that I see and that we've discussed is that the current architecture does not take into account the interplay between the parameters. We know that the TR, the flip angle, all the MRI parameters are related to each other. And if the TR changes in one way, the flip angle changes in another way, the contrast will change with respect to those two parameters. So we need to find a link between those parameters. That would also help to regularize the network. So our hypothesis here is that by introducing MRI equation, we would, as I mentioned, regularize the signal and also take into account the interplay between the input parameters for ultimately better generalization. So we can take, for example, the Bloch equation, which was introduced almost a century ago by Felix Bloch, and that's for one particular MR sequence, but you have an equation for different sequences. And the signal could be explained by some of the parameters. Now, there are some parameters that we know, that we basically program when we take a picture of someone in the MRI. And there are parameters that we don't know, but that the model could ultimately learn. So that's our goal. And we also know that we can basically constrain those parameters. These are intrinsic parameters of our tissue, right? In the white matter and the gray matter, you will have a particular T1, a particular T2 star, and so on. Okay. Problem we are currently facing is how do we introduce this equation in the architecture? So, anybody in this room has great idea that could be helpful for our problem, please email us immediately, and we'll work together. We have some avenues, but nothing that we are really convinced could be easily implementable. So we are still looking. Okay, so I'm almost done with this talk. I wanted to touch base on another aspect to conclude this, to basically loop with the notion of quantitative MRI. I told you that MRI can do fancy things. It can basically quantify the density of neurons non-invasively. But of course, if you're a critical scientist, you would ask, are those numbers really true? In order to address the question, we need to do validation. How do we do validation with quantitative MRI? The traditional approach is to take a sample, a brain, let's say an ex vivo brain. We put it in the MRI. We collect all those fancy QMR techniques. And then we take this sample. We stain it. We put it into epoxy or agar. Then we polish it. We put it in a large scale scanner. It could be electron microscopy, optical microscopy. We get those very high resolution windows that we merge together, segment the little cells that we are interested to quantify. We resample to the resolution of the MRI. We register those two images together. And then for each pixel in the image, we basically compare the histology and the MRI. And then we validate, are those numbers real or not. Okay? So I want to be fast on the segmentation aspect because that's critical and needed. So if we look at rat spinal cord, so it's an axial cut of a rat spinal cord, we start zooming it. So you have the scale window here. We're getting closer, and that's basically our friends, the axons and the myelin sheath surrounding it. So in red, you have the myelin that we are interested in quantifying. We are also interested in quantifying the density of those cells. So we basically need to segment individually the myelin sheath and those neuronal cells in order to compute those metrics that MRI gives us. So let's put things into numbers. So the density of axons is about 100,000 axons per millimeter square. The cross-sectional area of this white matter here is about 10 millimeters square. And the time to segment manually an axon and myelin for a well-trained grad student is about 1 minute. So if we do the calculation, it would take about 1 year, or 2 years actually, to segment this slice without the collateral benefits. So obviously, that's a great task for deep learning, and we started to work on another project called AxonDeepSeg, which is open source. And if you have some, histology segmentation task, please try this out and give us some feedback. It's based on the UNet, and we trained 2 different models for scanning and transmit electron microscopy. As you can see, the contrast between those 2 images is quite different, which let us train 2 separate models. Okay. And that is obviously of great help because then you are able to segment automatically millions of axons and get quantitative measures of those images. Now there is one problem with that. As I mentioned, we trained 2 different models, okay, because empirically we found that these models represent the images that we're working with. The problem is researchers around the world started to download AxonDeepSeg, tried this on their data, and they emailed us, well, it doesn't really work, doesn't do a great job, is really far from what you're showing, and so on. And that's obviously due to the fact that similarly to MRI, there is also a large variability of image quality and features with histology. Users have specific needs. If you look at one modality, one particular combination of parameters, there is a good homogeneity of data sets. They look alike. However, across modalities, as you can see, there is a poor homogeneity. Our strategy here, and I'm showing that to you because it's a different strategy than the one we are trying to get with MRI, is to try to provide a framework to train a specific model for a specific application. Is there a smart way of doing that? Because obviously that comes with the burden of creating manual labels in order to train the model. So we would have to ask each researcher, each site, to do this, manual label for each new model. In order to address that, we've looked into the domain of active learning, where the idea here is to manually label the batches that are most uncertain for a prediction task. So as an example, we start off with a training set, okay, where we have the labeled data. And we test the model. And so there is a prediction. So there's a testing set, and there's also a prediction associated with it. And then we can identify the predictions that are the least certain, and that could be based on Monte Carlo samples from the dropouts. It could be based on Bayesian methods. There's a whole literature where you can get more information from Gall et al. About how to measure uncertainty with deep learning. But the basic idea is that we would predict labels. We would select those that are least certain, and then we would manually fix them. Once they are fixed, they would be input into the training set, and then the model would be trained with this additional, better informed and better labeled data set. So when we compare this uncertainty-based approach for labeling compared to randomly selecting batches for training new models, what you see here in the abscissa is that is the iteration. So basically, we start off with 5 labeled data sets, okay? And then we have some results. And then after those results, we select either using this uncertainty active learning approach or just randomly some new batches with a labeled data set. And what we see is that if we select the labels that are known to be the least certain, we end up improving the performance of the model much faster compared to the random selection. So that's just a demonstration that by doing this active learning approach, we can train models in a more efficient way with less burden for the users. So to conclude, large databases are exciting, but what we're facing in medical imaging are small data sets. And in fact, what I find is that small data sets with few labels are the reality. And we need to deal with that and find solutions for it. I showed you, an approach for MRI that we are trying to get, which is a one-fit-all solution. So we are really trying to generalize the models and basically create models that most MRIs in the world could work with. And so I think that real impact can be made if good solutions are provided for such scarce data, and also by providing clean code and maintaining it in a long-term way. And so to finish, I'd like to mention that this is a very generic statement, but innovative solutions are fostered by bringing communities together. And, we are quite lucky in Montreal to have the necessary expertise in MR physics, computer vision, and deep learning, which is a really vibrating community. And we just need to continue working together in order to improve the field. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge students in the lab who contributed heavily to the slides, collaborators, funding sources, and thank you for your attention.